I like to think that in these podcast episodes, we always go on journeys to the past together, with a wee bit of layering, anecdotes, and stories, if you like. Today, we revisit the Paris of yesteryear and see why it attracted foreigners like moths to a flame. So, close your eyes, rest back, and let's take that metaphoric time machine back to a Paris of 100 years ago. Hi, and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host. When I visit Paris, there are always a few things on my must-do list. After a breakfast and coffee at a cafe near my hotel, I will generally head down towards one of the cafes like the Dome in Montparnasse for some people watching. I will then mooch in the afternoon at Le Jardin de Luxembourg, watching some of the old men play speed chess, and then wander along to nearby Notre Dame, where the splendid English bookshop, Shakespeare & Co., is located. I usually follow up a visit there with a stop at the Highlander, a Scottish pub 5 minutes walk away, and generally find out some little touristic gems from the Scottish staff who you find are perhaps studying at the nearby Sorbonne, and the conversation can wonderfully veer in any direction over the course of a couple of drinks. I always book a hotel near Paris's most iconic area, Montmartre, with its steep stairs and views of a Paris twinkling in the evening that make the climb worth it. And the cafe used in the filming of my favourite film of all time, Amélie, is always worth jostling with the other tourists to get a seat. But with its effortless mix of Gallic charms and surliness, Paris has long since been a magnet for foreigners. Post-World War I found Paris the epicentre for what was described as the lost generation, so called as its inherited values were no longer relevant post-war. They would include the writers like Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, and the poet E. E. Cummings, and they would spend days and evenings drinking, talking, and dreaming. George Orwell, with his forever restless soul, lived in Paris in the 1920s. His semi-autobiographical novel, Down and Out in Paris and London, paints a vivid picture of living on the breadline in Paris and wandering London as a tramp. But for others, the acceptance of the sexually and racially indiscriminate Paris of the 1920s must have seemed like a nirvana. Americans Janet Flanner and Salita Solana were both talented writers working for The New Yorker and the National Geographic. The lovers set up home in Paris in 1922, and their life would involve such activities as searching for flea market treasures, having brioche together in the cafe for breakfast, doing errands during the day, writing in the afternoon and early evening, and sometimes departing afterwards for a visit to the bookstalls and a dinner of couscous and mint tea. They would hang out at Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare & Co. bookshop and entertain friends like F. Scott Fitzgerald. The gay scene flourished in Paris, with many bars and coffee shops owned by openly gay persons, and private saloons sprung up in the early 20th century like ones hosted by the American expats Nathalie Barney and Gertrude Stein, and they drew more and more expats. From 1909 until her death in 1972, at the age of 95, Barney hosted her legendary Fridays at her home at 20 Rue Jacob. And the ladies were certainly familiar with the club Le Monaco, situated in the fashionable Montparnasse for lesbians in Paris in the 1920s and early 30s, on the lookout for love, something more short-term, or just there to soak up the eye candy. Chances are you would have found yourself at Le Monaco. The host was Suzanne Jean Bull, known to all as Fred. She was charming and described in the diary of Agnès Nin, the writer of Delta of Venus, as possessing bright blue eyes, round face, little nose, and soft features. And it was in Le Monaco, in 1936, Fred met the fantasy of men worldwide, movie star Marlene Dietrich, and they would go on to have a love affair. In the club, you would see women confidently striding in there in a finely tailored tuxedos, a white carnation in their buttonhole, a cigar between their lips, and a monocle perched on their cheek. The hair slicked back, with not a strand of closely cropped hair fluttering in the evening breeze. Janet Flanner's Letters from Paris column ran in the New Yorker for 50 years. The column, which she wrote under the pen name Genet, chronicled everything from the Jazz Age, the Nazi occupation, to the student uprising in 1968. It became required reading for many generations of knowledge-thirsty Americans who wanted to understand the city's culture. Solana left Flanner after Flanner began an affair with an Italian editor, Natalia Danzi Murray. Solano took up with the sculptor Elizabeth Jenks Clark. But Flanner and Solano always remained friends and a part of one another's lives, their time together standing as a stunning portrait of left-bank lesbian romance. In 1974, almost 60 years after they met, Flanner wrote to Solano, "Rarely does a day go by where I don't think of you. Yes, you and I have known each other very, very long." And we can't think of Paris in the Jazz Age without thinking of the iconic image of Josephine Baker dancing naked, except for a skirt of artificial bananas and a beaded necklace. The beautiful Baker left such a mark on Paris that Hemingway described her as the most sensational woman he ever saw. And it's hard to think of a foreign woman so beloved by an adopted country. She was involved in the French war effort as a resistance fighter and received the Croix de Guerre and the Rosette de la Resistance. She was also made a Chevalier of the Legion d'Honneur by Charles de Gaulle. She's the only American-born woman to be buried with full military honours in France. She even had a square named after her in Montparnasse. And she was involved in another battle, this time for civil liberties, and she refused to play in American clubs that segregated. She had numerous love affairs, including with serial shagger Georges Simenon when she was 19. Simenon was born in Belgium but had lived in Paris from 1922, and he gave Paris its most famous detective. Between 1931 and 1972, the gruff, curmudgeonly Inspector Magritte would appear in 75 novels and 28 short stories. He wrote fast up to 80 pages a day. In 1931, 10 Magritte novels were published, and the books were written so fast, without outline, and hardly corrected at all. So much so that one fanciful tale is that Alfred Hitchcock was supposed to have telephoned one day. He was told, "Sorry, he's just started a novel." "That's all right, I'll wait," came the reply. Magritte knew every inch of Paris and knew no fear, except perhaps from his wife, the matronly Madame Maigret, who he loves and fears in equal measure. But if his literary creation was a one-woman man, the married Simenon was quite the opposite. It was for his voracious sexual appetite Simenon is also known for. He claimed to have sex with 10,000 women in his lifetime, and after he's finished his day's work, he frequented Paris's prostitutes, sometimes as many as 4 a day. And he didn't mind what kind of woman, tall, short, fat, thin, black, white, he just enjoyed them all. At the end of his life, his only regret that it could not have been more. Quote, "I literally suffered from knowing that there were millions of women in the world that I would never know." Like the end of World War I, post-World War II brought a whole new generation of artistic types to Paris, and this world was never more exemplified than in Helen Dundee's 1958 debut novel, The Dud Avocado, which perfectly encapsulates a privileged young American's love affair with the French capital. So much so that whilst reading, you can almost smell the cigarette smoke and taste the absinthe. Gordon Parks was a black photographer whose atmospheric photos captured American teenagers studying in Paris in the 1950s. And the years that Parks spent away in Paris were a turning point in his life, away from the inequalities of life in the United States. He wrote in his 1990 memoir, Voices in the Mirror, "I needed Paris. It was a feast, a grand carnival of imagery, and immediately everything good there seemed to offer sublimation for those inner desires that had been so long hampered by racism back in America. For the first time in my life, I was relaxing from tension and pressure. My thoughts, continually rampaging against racial conditions, were suddenly becoming as peaceful as snowflakes. Slowly a curtain was dropping between me and those soiled years." Parks is perhaps best known now for being the driving force of the blaxploitation genre of the 70s and the director of the classic film Shaft. 1950s Paris was also known as the place where unpublishable books could be published. Olympia Press was formed by Maurice Giroudais in 1953. It specialised in books which could not be published without legal action in the English-speaking world, and writers like William Burroughs and Henry Miller went to be published there. The books would generally have that magic ingredient known as sex, and if wasn't enough, then Giroudais would demand that more was added. Alexander Trocchi was Britain's only beat writer, and his 1954 novel, Young Adam, tells the story of a man who finds a body in the canals between Glasgow and Edinburgh. When presented with a draft copy of the book, Giroudais demanded more, and a bizarre sex scene involving custard was added. It was made into a 2003 film of the same name, starring Ewan McGregor. J.P. Dunleavy's 1955 The Ginger Man is for me Ireland's greatest novel. It was immediately banned in Ireland and the US on publication. It's gone on to sell 45 million copies worldwide, and the story behind the book is as infamous as the content, with Dunleavy going on to sue Girodias and taking control of the company. But the most famous publication was Nabokov's 1955 tour de force, the controversial Lolita. It really is a magnificent piece of writing and widely misinterpreted, although not for everyone. Malcolm Bradbury wrote of the novel. At first famous as an erotic novel, Lolita soon won its way as a literary one. It was widely believed that it was based on the abduction from New Jersey of 11-year-old Sally Horner by child molester Frank DeSalle. They spent 21 months travelling in various states. He would pretend to be her father, and during this period, he raped her repeatedly. On arrest, DeSalle was convicted to 30 to 35 years in prison. And the return of Sally was tragically short-lived, when she died at the age of 15 when the car she was in ploughed into the back of a truck, killing her instantly. But whilst perhaps taking some details from the case, Nabokov's book stemmed from a Russian poem he wrote in 1928 called Lilith. In August 1933, a crime was perpetrated in Paris which shocked the country and the perceived sanctity of family values. And it was a crime that even the pen of Simenon wouldn't have conceived. 18-year-old Violet Nozier was born in 1915, and she lived with her parents at number 9 Rue de Madagascar. Just before midnight on Monday the 21st of August 1933, she returned from a night out. Not long after entering, she ran out screaming and banged on her neighbour's door. Her neighbour, Monsieur Melillo, and his wife came to the commotion. The whole house was woken up, and the concierge came running up the stairs. Violet cried, "Oh, it's terrible. I can't go back in there." On entering the flat, they found a strong smell of gas from an oven and the inert bodies of Violet's mother and father. It appeared to be a double suicide. Violet was led away from the scene. When the medics attended, they however found that while Jean-Baptiste was dead, his wife was barely clinging to life, and Madame Nozier was taken to nearby St. Antoine Hospital, and doctors battled to save her life. Assistant Police Chief Moser went to the flat to make his routine investigation into the double suicide attempt. None of the neighbours could give a rationale for the suicide. All they could say were the parents were worried for their wayward daughter, who had left home a month ago and came and went. Violet, however, was nowhere to be found, and no one knew where she might be. Moser thought, "She'll turn up in the morning. She's probably just a little upset." There was no money in the flat, several bank books in a drawer, and nothing out of place. There was also no suicide note. The only thing that Moser found out of place was a kitchen table set for 3 persons, with food remains on all the plates. If they'd committed suicide after eating and didn't clear it away, then who was the third person? The concierge provided a solid witness and stated she'd been sitting outside at the entrance to the block until 10 p.m, and stated that neither Violet or anyone else except tenants had entered. The Moulils, who'd retired an hour before Violet's commotion, stated they hadn't heard anyone entering or leaving next door's flat, and they were sure they would have noted, as every noise travelled. In the morning came a report which put a different complexion on the case. Violet's mother, who was in a coma and uncertain to survive, was found to have large doses of barbital, a sleeping tablet, in her system. An autopsy of Jean-Baptiste found similar doses. 2 of the wine glasses were found to have traces of barbital in them. In the kitchen bin, they found a note signed by a Dr. Doran, addressed to Violet's parents, instructing them to take the powders which enclosed. A senior inspector, Inspector Guillem, was brought in. In a dresser drawer, they found love letters addressed to Violet from a man called Louis Pierre, and the letters had his address. Inspector Guillem interviewed Dr. Doran, who acknowledged that whilst it was his stationery, it wasn't his writing. He also added he didn't know the couple, but was treating Violet for anemia. He went to visit Louis Pierre, a law student with wealthy parents. No one was home, but neighbours stated he was a rather wild-living young man, and his girlfriend Violet had been staying with him. The police searched nearby cafes, and on questioning, they found a blonde girl, Madeleine Debise. She said that she was Violet's best friend, but didn't know where she was. She also dispelled the police's notion that Violet had been the third person. She stated, "Violet and I were at a party with a student friend last night, that would be Monday. We had dinner about 5 p.m. at Brasserie up the street and spent the evening dancing at the Bal Tabarin. We were tired, and at about 11 p.m. Violet said she would go home to her parents for the night." Madeleine was even able to tell them of Violet's movements earlier in the day, which could be corroborated. Violet had had lunch with an artist at a cafe on the Boulevard Haussmann, in the afternoon riding around with 2 Egyptian students in their new car. But whilst this cleared her of suspicion, further investigation painted her as a wild and amoral girl. One report read she was always at trouble at school, and since 12 or 13 she's been running around with one man or another, being so attractive. Violet had left home several times and was constantly quarrelling with her parents, asserting her want to live her own life. The neighbour also stated the Nazaires had almost been overcome in a gas leak 2 months previously. Moreover, 3 or 4 times they'd complained of terrible abdominal pains after eating. Violet also complained of these pains. The inspector ascertained that Jean-Baptiste and his wife had 180,000 francs in the bank, quite a tidy sum. The inspector tracked down Louis Pierre, who stated that he and Violet had been friends for about a year. His parents disapproved of Violet and forbade him from seeing her. Louis Pierre also admitted that Violet had been receiving money from other men, as Louis Pierre's parents had cut his allowance. He stated he hadn't seen her for a week, but she had written him a letter stating that she had inherited money, was going to buy a car and come and get him. Although she wasn't a suspect in her father's death, the police desperately wanted to talk to her, and she was missing. A report came from Jean-Baptiste's workplace. On the Monday, he'd failed to turn up for work for the first time in 10 years, and without a word. And then, the case was blown wide open. Madame Nazaire regained consciousness. She was told her husband was dead, and she told staff and police that Violet had poisoned them. The dinner was explained by the fact that Violet had dined with them on the Sunday. They had lain there, before any alarm, for almost 30 hours. For Inspector Guillem, it started falling into place. Violet then established alibis for Monday, went home, turned on the gas, and a short while later ran screaming to their neighbours. And now the hunt for the killer was on. The public were appalled, and the newspapers demanded the guillotine. Madame Nozaire stated Violet had persuaded us to take the powders for a headache in their wine glasses right after dinner. Stricken in a few minutes, they'd gone to bed while Violet went to call a doctor. On Violet's return, she gave them more liquid, which she said was from the doctor. Madame Nozaire remembered nothing more. It also appeared that 4,000 francs had been in the flat prior to the dinner. And despite being on the front pages of every newspaper, there was no sign of Violet for almost a week. Until the 29th of August, Henri Debec, an engineer, reported to the police he'd met and made a date with a girl who called herself Christine, but he was sure it was Violet. And when Violet turned up for her date, she found the police waiting for her. Violet admitted to killing her father, but stated that he had assaulted and raped her on a trip to the countryside, and she was pregnant by him. Medical tests, however, proved her not to be pregnant, and it was also proved that the assault and rape could have not taken place on the date given. Violet also claimed that an elderly professor at the Sorbonne had given her 3,000 francs. This was again disproved. It was more than a year before her case was heard, and on the 13th of October 1934, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine. However, on Christmas Day, President Lebrun commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. She was, however, freed in 1945, and she died at the age of 51 in 1966. Well, that's it for another episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. If you want to see the photos from this week's episode, have a look on the Twitter page under the Historic Crimes and Criminals podcast. And also, if you fancy buying me a post-lockdown beer, you will find my Ko-fi website link on today's show notes. And until next time, bye bye.